Minister, I'd like to welcome this bill. I think it contains in particular two very important measures around gender quotas and funding that go some way to addressing what is a very big problem in this country, which is the fact that this House, Dáil doesn't do, I believe, for the Irish people and the Irish state what it could do or what it should do. I believe we're operating well below what we're capable of. During the election last year, late one night, I was talking to an American friend of mine, and we were figuring out if, in the unlikely event of me getting elected to this House, what possible impact one independent TD could have to try and do his or her bit to get us out of this mess. And I had a pretty jaundiced view of politicians, and I kept referencing this, and I found it deeply uncomfortable to begin referring to myself as a potential politician. And she said to me, you know, you've got to stop that. She said, politics is an incredibly honourable profession. It is the greatest honour to serve your country and to serve your people. And she was certainly reflecting a view which I saw in the Kennedy School in Boston and in America when I lived and worked there in Boston and in DC. And I have absolutely no doubt that every single member of this House feels that it's an honour to serve and that they are patriotic, hard-working, smart people. But it's not the view of the public in Ireland. I was shocked to see this year the Edelman Trust Survey said that 70% of Irish people, and I quote, Minister, do not trust their government leaders at all to tell the truth. Do not trust their government leaders at all to tell the truth. 7 out of 10. Of the 25 countries surveyed, we scored 24th. Only Italy seemed to inspire less trust than we do, and we've all seen rankings that show that politicians are routinely rated as the least trusted people and the least trusted profession in the country. Now, it's not inevitable. I've lived in countries where this is absolutely not the case. It's not structural. It doesn't have to be. I would put it to you, Minister, and I would put it to the House, that the total breakdown in trust that exists in Ireland, and it's not getting any better, unfortunately, between the public and us in this House, is the result of two things. It's the result of the rules which we apply to ourselves, which this bill goes some way to addressing, and it's the result of the culture. It's a result of how we behave within those rules that has caused and perpetuates and is not fixing this breakdown in trust. Now, political scientists have a particular view. I'd like to come at it from a slightly different perspective, which is from my own background. I spent the last few years in the private sector working with very large, very complex public sector organisations, helping their senior management teams figure out how to make those organisations better, higher performing, doing more for the public than they currently do, and usually with less and less money. And the area that I focused on particularly was the culture of the organisations. Did the employees understand what the organisation was trying to do? Did they agree with it? Were they consulted in what the priorities of the organisations were? Did they know what was expected of them? Do they have the capabilities to do that? Do they have opportunities to develop? And so forth. Now, the empirical evidence from all over the world is very compelling in terms of getting organisations, complex organisations, to up their performance, to really step up. And it says this, it says in order for an organisation to be high performing, it must have the right systems, or in our case, it must have the right rules. And it must have a healthy culture. And I would put it to you, Minister, and I would put it to my fellow deputies, that Dáil has neither. We don't have the right rules, and we don't have the right culture. And I think if we can get the rules right, and if we can change our culture, that we really can serve the people of this country in a new way and in a better way. This chamber and the Seanad should be the beating heart of Irish politics. It should be full of rigorous debate. But it's not. It is sometimes, but often it feels to me like something of a sham of democracy, something of an illusion of democracy. We have ministers come in during priority questions or during topical issues, and they'll read the start of their statement, and a member of the opposition will challenge that and make a few points, and the minister will simply read the second part of the statement, regardless of what's been said. And I'm sure that many of the current government deputies found exactly the same thing, the same frustrations when they were in opposition. Ireland is recognised as having the most centralised power, executive power of any Western democracy. That is, we the Oireachtas do not hold our government, our cabinet, to account in the same way that other parliaments do. The extent of the centralised control can be quite shocking. Recently, at the Finance Committee, we were issuing an invitation to Governor Honohan to come in to see us. One of the government deputies wanted to frame the invitation in a particular way. It was no big deal. It was an internal Finance Committee issue. And the whip was applied. Word came from the executive that the invitation had to be written in a certain way. There was a vote called. As it happened, the government deputies didn't get in to the committee room in time, and I had the pleasure, possibly the one pleasure of the one time it'll happen in this entire Dáil, of defeating the government in a vote. But it was symbolic of real control for Electoral. The committees are meant to be at least quasi-independent, where opposition TDs, government TDs really can go beyond party lines and really bring everything they have to bear in scrutinising legislation. The Finance Committee is a very important committee, obviously, particularly at the moment, isn't even allowed write the wording in its own invites. It makes a mockery of any independence that Finance Committee could have. In terms of the process, TDs are given almost no notice of legislation. We find out on Thursday what's coming up the following week. Most of us are in the constituencies on the Friday. And the Oireachtas Research Service doesn't get any additional notice either. So it's very difficult to put serious time and energy and scrutiny into upcoming legislation. And the research professionals who are there to help us, of course, don't have the time either. So a lot of the time we don't get debate packs. Now, one of the very worrying things I've noticed as a new TD, coming from a highly quantitative world where things are usually, proven with evidence, backed up with empirical evidence theory and so forth, is a real absence of that here. Now, it may go on at the Cabinet and it may go on in the departments, but as a TD in Dáil Éireann, I don't see it. Regulatory impact analysis is meant to happen for all major legislation, but it doesn't. It didn't happen for the Social Welfare Bill, for example. There was no poverty impact analysis. There was no regulatory impact analysis. There was no gender impact analysis. So, in terms of how many people the various measures were going to put into poverty or at risk of poverty, nobody had worked it out. Nobody knew that. I was describing it as, what does this button do? Policy making, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it is a very serious implication. In terms of the budgetary process, the OSCE ranks us as second worst in the OSCE. We come 35th out of 36 countries surveyed. On a scoring of the level of data given to Parliament to interrogate a budget, we score 0 out of 10. It's extraordinary that we would score 0 out of 10. And in the time given to Parliament to scrutinise the legislation, to use this data and then come back into the chamber and really try and hold the government to account, we score 0 out of 10. So it's basically impossible to meaningfully hold the Minister for Finance, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform to account on two of the most important pieces of legislation that come before this House every year. Now, worse than that, when the capital expenditure programme was announced, it was a list. It was just a list of stuff. It didn't say, here's how we arrived at it. It didn't have any technical appendices. It didn't have decision criteria. It just said, here's how we're going to spend over 30 billion euros of borrowed money. Now, in the chamber, I asked the Minister if I could have the technical appendix. I said, I can't tell you whether or not I agree with this. I can't tell you whether I agree with the school building versus the road building. Can I have the technical appendix? Can I have the decision criteria? Can I have the cost-benefit analysis? And he said no. He said, you can't. He said, you can go and try and get it from the departments if you like. But, you know, the phrase that he uses is, we were elected to govern. Which, you know, is unhelpful, I would say. The guillotine, Minister, has now been used by this government on 68% of its own legislation. In spite of what is said in the programme for government, in spite of all of the talk of reform and not using statutory instruments, not using the guillotine, nearly 7 out of 10 pieces of legislation that this government has brought forward have used the guillotine. You will have seen 2 weeks ago that the guillotine was used on every single section of the social welfare bill. This is not good. And statutory instruments, again in the programme for government, the intent was to stop using these. Well, on an internet copyright issue, which had a statutory instrument, Minister Sean Sherlock debated with Catherine Murphy, myself and others. For an hour, we submitted a counter proposal. And at the end of the debate, I asked Minister Sherlock if he would take on board a single proposal, a single word, a single letter that had been said during the debate. And he said, I'm not changing anything, and I told you before the debate I wasn't going to change anything. And that, for me, really symbolised a culture whereby people who've been on this side of the House for years, passionate about getting into government and doing the right thing, within a year are saying things like that. It's just an extraordinary symbol of a culture that says this House is not really here to influence the legislation. Obviously there are notable exceptions, but it's a very serious issue. Now, the issue, of course, is one of the other problems, and this comes down to culture rather than formal rules, is that even if TDs, if we were given the data we needed and we were given time to use it, the problem for opposition and government TDs alike is they pretty much have to say what they're told within reason, but they have to toe the line and they have to vote the line as well. This is really dangerous. An example is the Oireachtas Inquiries referendum. All of the parties canvassed on a yes vote. Now, it was defeated. An awful lot of the deputies I spoke to in this House privately said they were voting against it. And they were telling everyone they knew to vote against it because they had serious concerns about it. Now, I don't mean to bring up whether or not a yes vote or a no vote was correct, but to me that is an extraordinary failure of us as the people's representatives to give a balanced view to the people. It's a very dangerous manifestation of this strict adherence to the party whip. We've, to me, a ludicrous situation right now with Deputy O'Keefe and the referendum. He has said that he has agreed not to say publicly what he believes to be true, which is a no vote. Now, when that's the case, is it any wonder that nobody trusts us? You know, when a politician says what he believes, he is obliged and told to stay quiet, that he can't say that. You know, how dangerous could it be to Fianna Fáil to have one of its prominent members say, you know what, I respect the party line, I don't agree with it, here's my opinion. I've been in here a long time, I've got a lot of experience, and here's what I believe, you know. I don't know when it became the consensus that parties and the political system as a whole were so allergic to dissent. Now, I hope, I don't know, I've never been to a parliamentary party meeting. I'm sure that there's plenty of good, rigorous debate in them, but it's not reflected publicly. And part of the impact of that is nobody trusts us, you know. Now, of course, there have been improvements, in fairness to the government. You know, the topical issues debate has been good. The Friday private members' motion, I was lucky enough to have one of them, and it was a fantastic opportunity. But I think we are tinkering at the edges. And I think whilst I really do welcome this bill and what it does and where it's going, I feel it is still marginal at a time when you have the space, and I think there is the need to be radical. Article 28(4) of the Constitution says that the government shall be responsible to Dáil Éireann, to us. The government shall be responsible, stroke accountable to this House. And my experience of the last year says that it is not in any way accountable to this House. And the examples I've given suggest a culture which says in no way does it believe itself to be accountable to this House. And I think we are less than we could be with that culture in place. Now, the bill looks at gender quotas and political funding. As I've said publicly before, I applaud the Minister for taking on the move to gender quotas. I think it is a fantastic thing. You know, the situation we're in is appalling. We're 77th in the world in terms of gender quotas. We're 22nd amongst the 27 EU members. It's absolutely shocking. 15% of the Dáil are female, and only 12% of Cabinet are female. And of course, as we all know, it's getting worse. 15% of candidates last year were women, which is the lowest amount since 1989. So we're one of the worst in the developed world, and getting worse, unfortunately. And of course, this isn't represented in the makeup of the parties or political interest. Fianna Fáil is the most noticeable example, where I believe 35% of the party is female. It could be slightly more, and there's not a single female TD. It's an extraordinary situation. Almost half of no constituencies have female TDs. That's a pretty shocking situation. And of course, at local government, the situation is just as bad. 16% of councillors are women. I think only 2 of the 24 county councillors in Wicklow County Council are women. So a shocking situation. Nobody likes quotas, but the research is pretty unambiguous, as the Minister, I'm sure, has seen, which is it doesn't work without quotas. When your system is so totally skewed and dominated by men, bringing in quotas is a necessary but not sufficient element of a policy response to kick the system back to a better equilibrium. We're all aware of the 5 C's report, which says that candidate selection, cash, childcare, confidence and culture are the 5 blockers to more female participation. Well, evidence from around the world says that the critical mass is 30%, which of course is reflected in the initial quota, and that at 30% candidate selection—
2 minutes.
Thank you. Things begin to happen. Now, I would put it to the Minister we need to go further than this. France and Belgium have quotas of 50%. Spain has its quota of 40%. The 30% rule requires very, very minor changes from Fine Gael and Labour in terms of finding more female candidates. The timing issue says that we won't hit 40% by probably 2021. And Minister, I would say to you that I really do applaud what you're doing, but I would say go to the 40%. Go to the 40% sooner rather than later, and apply it to local government. You've said to me in the House before in response to a question that you didn't have the power to apply it to local government because political funding only applied nationally. Find it. We make the rules in this House. Let's make a rule that allows it to apply to local government. I think it needs to happen. On political funding, I also welcome the various changes in the bill. I would, however, urge a serious look at party political funding. We have a very strange situation in this country whereby some political funding goes directly to the elected TDs. We all get our parliamentary allowance, we get a travel allowance, we get a staff, we get an office. We get a staff of 2. And independent TDs get a leader's allowance, which the other TDs don't get. However, the parties per TD get vastly more than the 42,000 that the independent TDs get. Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin get 120,000 per TD, and nearly 1 extra staff member for a central secretariat. Labour and Fine Gael get about 60,000 and 70,000 extra per TD and an extra staff member. They get less because they're in government and have access to the civil service. I would put it to you, Minister, that a much healthier and more democratic system would be for all political funding to be directed to the TD. The power, the authority is invested in each of us as deputies of Dáil Éireann. If Deputy Timmins wants to be a member of Fine Gael, and the rule in Fine Gael is to join, you've got to give us this much staff and this much money, that's fine. And if someone wants to leave a party, they get to take it with them. I would ask, just in wrapping up, Ceann Comhairle, I would ask the Minister to take a serious look at two things. At directing all political resources and funding to each TD, and let parties decide amongst themselves how much they want to give up. And secondly, to radically reducing the amount of political funding. As an example, if the parties got per TD what independent TDs get at the moment, it would save the Exchequer over €10 million per year. So, Minister, I applaud what you're doing. I would implore you to be more radical. You have the political space, and there is a need in the country for bigger and bolder changes than this. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Thank you. I now